Welcome to the show. My name is Bret. This is my channel. Channel if you're on YouTube. I don't know what you call it on Periscope. I guess it's a Periscope channel. And also on Twitch, in case that's your platform of choice. I've started recently consistently restreaming to all three, so why not? It just adds a few seconds of delay. We'll be fine. I'm everywhere. So you're here to talk about DevOps tools, specifically containers, and that's what my channel is all about. And in fact, we just hit 2 years a couple weeks ago, 2 years of doing this almost every week, sometimes with guests, sometimes without. It's the summer here in Virginia, so I've been taking it a little bit easy and not having a bunch of guests, but we're going to have a guest next week to talk all about a new way in September to learn Docker in a month of lunches. And so you learn a bunch of tooling in 1 month, and it's going to be a pretty cool episode. I don't want to spoil it all, but definitely show up next week for a special guest, and we'll be talking about that stuff. Also, I'm just realizing my hat's a little transparent in the green screen. Yeah, so that's kind of silly. I've got some news today. I've got a great demo I want to get to. I'm excited. I talked about it last week. If you were here last week, you saw me tease out in a really rough way a demo of an idea I had for a very easy local setup for always having TLS Proxy for all your development HTTP stuff. Well, it doesn't even have to be HTTP because the proxy can do regular TCP stuff too. But instead of having a whole bunch of different ports on your machine, and if you have a microservice app or a distributed app, and you have like an API and a web front end, and maybe something else, and they're all websites, or maybe you're just running a bunch of various websites all behind a proxy in production, and you want to have that experience locally when you're deving and testing. I thought I've had so many of my clients and my students all ask for this, and I keep coming up with custom solutions. I thought, wouldn't it be nice if we just had a template that at least you could look at, it would make sense, and you could spin it up in 5 minutes and have permanent, local, trusted TLS certificates for free that would work with your development environment. So that's what I have to show off today. Documentation could probably still use some improvements, but other than that, it's ready to go. I want you to test it and let me know. Before we get to that, a couple of housekeeping items. So I'm live here every week, which means if you're watching me on YouTube, then you like and subscribe, you click the little dinner bell so that you get the notification pop-ups when I go live. That way you don't miss the show and you can still ask your questions. Of course, these videos are always kept on YouTube forever. And so if you're watching on Twitch or Periscope, jump over to YouTube. You can do that at, wrong side. Always the wrong side, Bret. Bret.live over there. That's where you can go to YouTube to get all the back episodes of the videos. And if you want to support this show and the podcast that comes out of it, which I know I haven't released a podcast in several weeks, and all the other open source I'm doing, basically you can do all that in one single way, and that is on Patreon. You can get 2 monthly memberships there. You don't have to get a membership. So if you want to know all the things I'm doing, you can just follow. So if you just scroll down on that page, you can click follow. That's free. So if you're using the Patreon app or if you sign up with a Patreon account, then you'll get these emails that are very specific to only the things I'm doing or changing. So it's new software I'm releasing, new live shows I'm doing, new podcasts, new open source that I'm working with other people on, new updates to my courses. Most of it's free stuff. Some of this stuff you would like courses you might pay for. But if you want to fully support the channel, make sure that I'm, here to stay. You can become one of my Patreon patrons, and that's a membership package. You get benefits. You will also, thank you, by the way, thank you to all of you who are already patrons. And we will be having a call. You'll see that later today, a patron announcement later today for next week's DevOps chat. So we started doing, earlier this year, I started doing monthly Zoom hangouts for anyone on the $5 club. It's basically, to me, it's like $5 to keep the spammers out, So what we had a Zoom call. You can join, hang out. You don't have to ask questions. You don't even have to be on video if you don't want. You can just listen in. And it's basically like, going to lunch with a bunch of your colleagues, right? You just learn about what people are doing. People have questions. People might talk about projects they're looking into or things they're struggling with or things they just finished or whatever, right? It's just a hangout. So we do that for about an hour or so once a month, and we're having it again next week. So hopefully you'll check that out. Let's do the next little piece of news. So if you were here last week, Docker had announced some changes coming to Docker Hub. And really what this is all about is Docker's been giving us all a free ride for 5 years of Docker images, right? And whether you have been logged in or not, you've been able to pull terabytes of data, petabytes of data, unlimited amounts of data from Docker Hub. And so they're trying to figure out how to control that, as well as get rid of everything that's not, all the unused storage images that aren't being, all the registry repos that are ignored and not used. It turns out 4.5 petabytes of image data hasn't been even pulled or pushed or touched in over 6 months, and a significant portion of that hasn't been used in years. So they're wanting to do cleanup, which means they now are going to have a retention policy and also API pull limits, meaning that when you do a Docker pull, if you're doing a lot of them every day, you will hit some sort of limits and possibly be denied pulls. So if you have an automated solution that's maybe doing, a bunch, we'll get into that in a little bit, because that was a little bit of a surprise or change to this. And Docker is going to be clarifying a whole lot of this. So I don't want to give you all the details, because they're going to be doing updates to give us more information, because this is we're 3 months away from this actually happening. So they're testing the waters with this. A lot of us gave feedback that they could have been better in this announcement and been more clear with more questions and answers that, than the stuff that we have now. So they're going to do that. And they are working on those responses now. So we don't have an updated FAQ, but I'm told that is coming. And a couple of the confusions about this is not, for almost all of us, this is not a big deal. Unless you run a big open source project or you're running an enterprise and you don't have internal registries, then this is probably not going to affect you. But there's a couple of things that you might want to pay attention to that I just want to give you a heads up on, a quick, short recap of what we did last week. There's 2 parts to this, all right? One is, if you're storing images for free, again, if you're paying $5 a month on Docker Hub, none of this is an issue. But if you're using it for free, then the images you're storing there, if they haven't been touched, if not a single tag of that image repo, that repository, if nothing has been pulled in over 6 months, then that repo will be deleted. Okay? So again, I talked last week that really, to me, Docker Hub is about artifacts and operational automation. It's not where you store your code. It should not be where you have your backups. It's not a long-term retention thing. I never treated it that way. It was always the output of my builds, of my binary builds, of my Docker file builds. It was always the binary. So if I lost it, no big deal. I could always recreate it. I didn't lose my work. But if you haven't done a single pull of any of your apps in a repository, again, this is per repository, so each image repository, if none of those tags have been pulled, or no pushes, or none of the updates to that repository in 6 months, and you're not paying for it, then they will be deleted. Okay, the whole repository. That's how I understand it now. But we're going to wait on more clarification, because some of us have been confused about what is a image, what is a repository, what is a tag, what is a layer of an image, because technically each layer is a separate download. So there's a lot there. So they're going to be more clear in the future. We got plenty of time to work all this out. But the ultimate solution to this is, if you are using Docker Hub for Business, just pay for it. $5 for a single user. A company, obviously, with lots of accounts is going to have to pay a lot more money. But basically, the free ride for unlimited use of Docker Hub is finally, after 5 years, coming to an end. And I think it's something they should be doing. So they are going to be, if you have questions, they're going to evidently have some more ways to get a hold of them if you want to ask questions. And they're going to be updating this a lot. But can you imagine, right? 4.5 petabytes of unused data. That's a lot. That's a lot. All right, let's see if there's any questions on that. Before I go to talking about pull limits, which is a separate issue, a totally separate limitation, let's talk about image retention. I just want to see if there's any questions on that. I did get a haircut, finally, a COVID haircut, and a new hat. Let's see. Thanks, Ivor. Patreon group is fun. I agree. By the way, if you're taking any of my courses, you might have been seeing Ivor this year answering questions in there. He is doing a great job of answering questions. And so thank you for that. Ivor. Been great. Let's see. Okay, so some of you are asking questions we'll get to later, unrelated questions. I'm focusing on announcements right now, but I'll come back to you. Does the limit pull thing include paid accounts or just the free ones? So we'll get into the image pull limit here in a minute. Right. Yeah. If you don't care about your repository for 6 months, why should Docker? Yeah. And the reality is that any business, I mean, any software as a service tool on the internet obviously is a business. We're always trying to reduce costs, but I feel like it's a no-brainer. If you're using GitHub for your packaging or AWS, you're paying for those image registries, right? In terms of storage. So Docker Hub doesn't pay for storage. Docker Hub pays per account. So to me, it's just Docker Hub becoming like the rest of everyone else that allows you to store images. I know Quay and some others do allow some free plans, but Docker Hub is huge, right? It dwarfs all the rest of them. So I think it's totally fair for them to do this. What we want them to do is be much more precise and clear on all the edge cases and all the scenarios. What does an image really mean? Because an image is a concept. When an image is really made up of manifest files and HTTP header requests, and then image layer tarballs that you download, right? So a lot of us had very specific questions about what is an image exactly, and are we deleting tags? Are we deleting repositories? So that there's a lot of questions around that, and I think we're getting a little bit more clarification. But I want to wait for the de facto for them to update the FAQ before we all consider it fact from the source of Docker. But I know they're definitely working on improving it. All right. So let's talk about the pull limit. So earlier this year, Docker did another announcement. Again, this is all on the path of Docker trying to make Docker Hub sustainable and charging more or charging especially for overuse, because they have a smallest, just like everything. It's like cellular data plans, right? It's like internet home Wi-Fi or internet usage. There's always those outliers, the 1% of the 1% that are using way more bandwidth than everyone else. And so that's also true with Docker Hub, I'm assuming, and that they're trying to limit that, right? So earlier this year, they came up with new pricing for the plans. You get new features out of the box, and it's kind of what we've been used to, but they've put it in a much more detailed breakdown. We've always had the free plan. You could always get one free repository. And now they're going to be doing that 6-month image retention limit. So that's another free thing. If you pay for an individual account at 5, or if you're an organization and you start paying for team accounts, the difference of a team account is that it's underneath it's a part of an organization. So slightly different than a pro account, which isn't managed by an organization. The team account is. So there's also a limited builds parallel stuff. If you're building a lot of images all day long, you'll care about the parallel build stuff. But basically, for all of us that have been free, we have been. You may not have realized it, but your images, when they build, they're waiting on the previous. You can only build one at a time, essentially, in your account. So, all right. Moving down to the bottom, though, is something else that wasn't very clear in their announcement, but people figured out by poking around the website, was that there's this change that was all about data transfers. Now, for some of us, especially in the open source community, this can be a bigger impact. This could be a bigger issue than the image retention. Because if you're if you have any open source and it's even remotely popular, it's going to have one pull every 6 months, right? I would argue that it's probably a dead project if it's not. And when we started talking about, when I was worried that it was related to tags, I could see that maybe I had some old tags that weren't pulled. But if it's even just any tag pulled in the last 6 months, as my understanding is, the image will be retained. But let's talk about this. This is a separate issue of you, not related to the person that's logging into Docker Hub that holds the images. This is about you pulling any image as just a user of Docker. So this affects everyone, whether you're a brand new in my Docker Hub, Docker Mastery course, you're just starting Docker Hub for the first time, or you're an enterprise that has, thousands of image pulls a day, right? Or, well, yeah, behind a single firewall, right? Like if you imagine if you had 100 developers, 200 developers, or you're Microsoft with 20,000 developers, and you're all behind a corporate firewall and you're all pulling images all day, even if you're logged in, it's saying here, if you're not paying for Docker Hub, even if you're logged in with a free account, you're limited to 200 pulls. Okay, that's 200 pulls per 6 hours. Now, we're still discussing, Docker is still not super clear on what a pull actually means. Is it a layer? Is it an image? We're still getting clarification on that, but I believe it's going to come down to, and they're going to update the FAQs and stuff, as what we're told, is that it's really per image. So an image might have 100 layers, 5 layers, 1 layer to the image, but it's going to be the image. And if you're a geek and you're wondering about how the protocol actually works there, I think it's going to be focused around the manifest file. So because Docker in the background is pulling this manifest file to figure out which architecture you have in order to determine which set of image layers you need to download. And so that file might end up being the ultimate thing. Again, we're months out from this. We're at least 3 or more months away. And supposedly they're going to be doing a lot more details, and have some more information here for us to understand. But basically, if you're not logged into Docker, if you're just on a server, or if you got a CI solution, if you're pulling 100 images every 6 hours, then you could start getting blocked, which is incentive to do a couple of things. One is that you can use Docker proxy caches for registry caches. That's actually a thing, and none of us have been using those because we didn't need to. Largely, some people have been using them. Very large companies are using them. Companies that have proxies in their data centers have to use them because they can't let all servers go directly to the internet. But for those of us that are just using this for small projects, small businesses, personal accounts, we will be affected by this. So the way you do that is, the first step is just log in. Start getting all your CI, getting all your servers, everything authenticated to log in. The next thing you could probably do is start looking at how caching works in Docker. Docker can use a proxy cache with Docker registry, and there's lots of solutions out there that offer this now. What we are hoping is that there will be some really great blog posts that Docker and others put out about how to do that. Some really great walkthroughs of, in this specific situation to solve this specific problem, let's say you want to cache all major images, right? Like all the free images, all the official images from Docker. So Nginx, Python, Java, you want all those images cached in your office. So how would you set up a single, container essentially to just cache all those, and then that way all of your internal CI, your internal servers can pull from there and not hit these limits so quickly. It's not going to be a lot of work to set that up, but it is a process, and we don't really have a lot of documentation on step by step by step. Now, Docker has that on their website, but a lot of people may not know about it. So, in fact, I can probably do a search. So on their cache, so a pull through cache here, and I'll put this into the chat. So this is step one. This is probably the most, I'm not going to say it's the easiest solution, but it's a single image. It's the Docker registry, which you've probably played with if you've ever taken my courses. And what you're doing is you're going to tell the Docker engine on each machine to use this as a cache. So it kind of shows you how to do this inside of Docker. Actually, that's down here. You're going to look at registry mirrors. Yeah. So it's only a couple of steps. And it's, to configure a registry to run as a pull-through cache, the addition of a proxy section is required in the config file. To access private images in the hub, a username and password. So your cache would be the thing that goes up and gets stuff, and then everyone else would be pulling from that mirror. There's a couple other steps to it, but there's some stuff there you can check out. Now, there are third-party tools as well. There are other registries that we can use, and that hopefully that stuff is going to start coming out. I'm going to try to. I'd hate to make a whole show about this because it could be totally boring for most people, but it would be great if we had sort of a resource center, I think, and I'm not sure if I'm able to do all that work, so I'm hoping that maybe some of the Docker captains, I can work with them and we can come up with sort of a, how do you handle this Docker Hub changing scenario, right? And Docker, I know themselves have said that they have told the captains that they're going to make some blog articles about it, so we're going to get some updates. All right. So, step 1, make sure you're authenticating in every way possible. This authenticated users or anonymous users limitation is based on your public IP address. It's not based on the original image you're pulling. It's based on you, the puller. So, again, this is all about basically limiting someone from pulling every image from Docker Hub, all 15 petabytes of it, because there's people doing that. So, we need to have some sort of restrictions in place. Personally, I would have liked to have bigger limits and then sort of ratchet this down over time. But these limits are per 6 hours. It's not per day, and it's a rolling 6 hours. So in the last 6 hours, if you haven't pulled 100 images, then you're fine, right? You're totally fine. And most of us on our local machine, we're never going to hit those. But if you're behind a corporate firewall and there's 20 of you, and you're all using Docker every day, you're all going to look like the same IP address from the internet, and thus you're going to be blocked as a company if you're not careful. So this is something that we're going to have to start caring about. And I think the caching is one level of it. If you're in a company, you'll have to come up with some kind of caching. But if you're just paying for Docker and always logging in, none of this is a problem. Again, if you're paying the $5 as an individual or $7 per engineer, this is not an issue. So I know there's a lot of edge cases people are talking about. What about my open source project? What about my CI solution? What about my internal CI compared to my cloud CI? Like, I get it. There's definitely a lot of that stuff going on. And I think that we're all going to come up with solutions and workarounds. There's already stuff coming out, by the way. I'm going to mention a couple that I have just learned about today that I haven't had a chance to check out. Over on GitHub, my friend Jerome has put out Registry-ish. I love the name. It's fantastic. I have not tried this yet, but it's a solution that I'll put into chat. And basically, it's a really interesting idea. I'm going to hopefully talk to him about this a little bit. Maybe we'll have him on the show, and I can have a show where I bring a couple of people on to talk about this. So, he is essentially using S3 to front end Docker Hub so that you're not hitting those limits. All right, and which is a great idea because S3 is already a worldwide CDN. You have to be careful because you could very easily end up with a terabyte if you use a lot of different images in your organization. You could end up with a half a terabyte of data in there, and you'd be paying a lot of money. So, but that's pretty neat. The other one actually was just recommended to me by Alex Ellis, he's making a tool. Let me go to Twitter. So, Alex replied with something he's calling registry creds. So this is Kubernetes specific, and it looks to be around helping you add Docker Hub authentication to your pulls with Kubernetes. Again, I have had 2 minutes to even look at this, but this is something else I will throw in there. We are, again, 3+ months away from any of these things being issues, but people are already coming up with solutions. And then we've got a bunch of other Docker Hub-like solutions out there, open source solutions that are run on Kubernetes or run on Swarm that are also registries that can act as caches or act as solutions to these pool problems, at least to limit them. Again, a lot of us, we're always going to have something doing Docker Hub pulls, because Docker Hub is the source of all of the official images. So if you ever use any of the official images in any capacity, something is going to have to do a Docker Hub pull, whether it's your caching image registry or it's your CI solution or something. So we're all at some way going to have to deal with this, I think, because there's, there are some things like Microsoft or Oracle or Red Hat, like some of these companies have their own images on their own registry that's not Docker Hub. So those images will be elsewhere. But for so many of us, we're still going to have something in Docker Hub. Like it may not even be our images. It may just be official. So I think it's probably even worth some once all this gets planned out, I'll probably figure out a way to make some videos about it and put them in my courses just so you can figure that stuff out. No promises, but I think this is a big enough deal that a lot of us going into production are going to hit these limits, and it's something we all have to care about. Because up until now, it's just been easy. You didn't have to care. You just simply did not care. But now we're going to have to. So, all right, let me check on questions, making sure that we're getting all the questions in. Sonatype Nexus. Yep, there's that. There's Harbor. Again, but all these solutions are still going to have images pulled from Hub. Something has got to get, Python. Something's got to get Nginx. Something's got to get Apache and, .NET Core. Well, that's going to be Microsoft, so that might be on Microsoft. But like all of these solutions are going to help, but they won't completely eliminate the need for authentication and possibly paid accounts. For me, it's like, I don't know. I don't know if this is against terms of service, but if I was running a business that needed a bunch of pulls and a bunch of CI, I would pay a $5 account and I would share those credentials with my team, and it would be put in all of our CI, strictly for CI, right? For CI solutions and server pools. Obviously, every server is not going to have its own pool. Every CI is not going to have, or every server and CI solution is not going to have its own account. I'm assuming that the terms of service are okay with that. I actually need to check on that. I don't really know. But it doesn't make sense that you would need, a pull authenticated per server for a different account, right? So if I've got, Acme Inc. as a company, then I buy even just a personal account, $5 a month, and then I throw those credentials in all my CI solutions, all my server pools, so that everything's at least authenticated. And since I'm paying and I'm authenticated, I'm done. It's unlimited pulls at that point for $5 for the company, right? There's a difference between that and an individual that's a developer on their machine doing private pulls, right, of private repos. Like that's a different thing. What I'm really talking about is authenticating those pulls so that Docker has someone paying for their bandwidth. I think that's the solution we're going to come up with. Again, I probably am not an expert on the terms of service. For those automated solutions that aren't a human manually pulling images, I don't see how that could be against terms of service, but I am not Docker. So you probably want to check with your terms of service and your lawyers and your company. I don't know. Eventually, I think we'll figure this all out. I think that's a great question that they probably should put in their terms of service is this type of use allowed for a single account across an organization? Well, GitHub, so that's a great point, test. So the thing about GitHub is they have a much bigger problem, right? GitHub and places like Bitbucket, they're storing your source code for free. And here's a couple of things to think about, because I've thought about this. I've been thinking about this for weeks, right? Docker Hub, let's just talk about like your Java app, right? So your Java app on Docker Hub in open source, which is free, that's maybe with all of the layers, a couple of 100 meg, right? At most, even if you're storing some binary assets like PNGs and stuff, it's really small. If you're doing something like a PHP app or a Node.js app, it's definitely less than 500 meg for just the source code, unless you've had it for like 5 years and you've got all these different versions, right? And so And that's source code. So there's two factors here. One, that's actually not very big. If you're talking about an image on Docker Hub with all of the different, like imagine an image with all the different tags and the history of that tag, right? An average person's probably using tens of gigs of data on Docker Hub for just a couple of images because their application is built into a binary, and then maybe they're keeping all these old versions because we didn't really have an easy way to delete old versions on Docker Hub before. So it's a much bigger, I think that in terms of the average use of storage, I think people are using way more storage on Docker Hub than they realize. On GitHub, because it's source code, they probably zip it on the back end. It's much more compressed. I'm assuming they have some sort of disk compression for all these plain text files. The other thing is source code is precious. Source code is the original thing. You can't delete that. If GitHub ever started deleting our source code, the internet would be on fire. Even and one of the things that they have now, if you've looked, is the GitHub Archive project, I think is what it's called, for keeping source code around forever in case we ever need it. Docker Hub is an artifact store, and we all of us that have been around containers now for 5+ years, if you've been around in software, especially in enterprise software, you know what an artifact store is. And typically artifact stores are the output. They're important. They need to be there, but they are not the source of truth, right? That's what the source code is about. The artifact store is about caching and making the binary outputs available, right? So it's kind of like an apt-get versus, apt-get is a artifact store. NPM, an artifact store. Those are all things that come from source code. So I wouldn't expect someone like GitHub to ever start killing off open source code that you're not paying for. Maybe unless it was 10 years old. It'd have to be a really big limit. Otherwise, we would all revolt. I think it's a much more approachable stance from Docker Hub's point of view, is they're saying, hey, you can always recreate the images. You can always just push the image, right, from your source code, and then you'd have it back. But that's a great point. Test. The main reason for the pull limitations is abuse of bandwidth. Docker has got to rein in on the unlimited bandwidth utilization that everyone has from the registry. And with 15 petabytes of images, if you've ever seen, and I don't know this for a fact, this is not me with insider information, but if you've ever seen some of these companies that do, they do like the state of Docker Hub images, guess what they're doing? They're in the background pulling all those images and scanning them constantly. And I can only imagine the bandwidth toll that that's taking. So now all Docker Hub is saying is, you need to give us $5 a month to do that. So I think that's that's totally fine. Yeah. Registry mirror. Yeah. All right. I'm seeing all these comments. Hello, Martin. KubeCon EU just ended. Yeah, and I have no KubeCon EU news this week. Sadly, I have had a bunch of things going on, and I've been on KubeCon each day, but I don't have a lot to report. It was a bunch of videos on a website, and we were all hanging out in Slack. And it's not a real conference. It's kind of sad. I wish we were all together in Amsterdam, but we weren't. And also because so much of it was happening ahead of me because it's an EU and I'm in America. I missed a lot. Like I wasn't able to watch the keynotes live because it was too early in the morning. Actually, well, they were in the middle of the day. So they were, yeah, so I could have watched them. But I didn't I didn't get up early in the mornings to watch them. So by the way, if you were watching KubeCon EU, please in chat, you can't post links, but let us know what topics we should look up that you thought were really interesting, because there were so many talks. I want to whittle down the list. So if you have any recommendations on, I know a lot of people, the K3S, the keys one from Darren Shepard of Rancher talking about Edge Kubernetes. I know a lot of people talked about that and his discussion. And then Keys announced that, or K3S or K3s or however you want to say it, they are now a CNCF. Darren actually announced that they are a CNCF incubator project, I think it's incubator. I'm not sure the right term for it. Um, Basically, a pet project of CNCF, which is great because for a long time now, there's been concerns that the CNCF would not allow Kubernetes, the K3's distribution of Kubernetes in because it's just a distribution. So that's been a really interesting thing that has happened. Anyway, yeah, ephemeral containers came up often on KubeCon. Yeah, the cache server stuff is not that hard. I put the link up in chat. It's really just a couple of steps, and if you're only using it for caching, and you're not going to actually store your own images there, then it's not a lot of work, and it shouldn't take up a ton of space, and you shouldn't have to do a lot with it. Especially if it's a small environment, right? If you're not dealing with thousands of images, and you're just using it as a pass-through cache, it's not going to need a lot of work. So I recommend checking it out. All right. So I think that's it for the image pull stuff. We'll have more news. And again, I'll probably do some sort of summary once we have all the facts, all the FAQ and the examples and the ways to deal with it and the workarounds and all that. I will do that. All right. Let's change subject. Unless you have more questions, I'm going to talk about my new TLS certificate composting. Yeah, the ephemeral container stuff. And if I remember correctly, Blazej, is that how I say your name? Blazej? Or Blazej? So ephemeral containers in Kubernetes are great for like troubleshooting, jumping in, doing stuff, then leaving the pod. And if I remember correctly, 119 is about to come out, and 119 we didn't get everything we were hoping for in basically the ephemeral stuff is still forthcoming. It might be in 120. So let me know if you know anything about that, because I did see something about that on the Twitters, and I'm curious if you have more information than I do. An open source free API monitoring tool that you can use, Noah, something like an open source tool for Datadog synthetics. Well, API monitoring. That's a good question. That's a little bit different, I guess, because like Prometheus does metrics. I don't think that Prometheus out of the box, and you probably already know this, I don't think Prometheus out of the box will do API monitoring. You might look at something from Glue. Let's see if I can find it. So Solo.io. Check out. This is for. Let's see, who's this for? This is for Blaze. Check out the Solo.io stuff. They've got a lot of open source, and I'm not an expert on all their products, but they have API proxies and other wizardry that I'll just say in their open source. They have a lot of projects here, so I'm not sure they're necessarily in the monitoring category, but oh my goodness, all the pop-ups. Jeez, people, come on. So just look at their stuff and kind of see if that might help you. I'm not sure it's really monitoring purely. There's probably a CNCF project for what you're asking for, and I'm just not aware of it. But yeah, that's about the best I can do for now. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That was for Eser. I was confusing Blaze and Eser, or Esser. Sorry, Esser, that's for you. Is it common to build and combine two Docker images, let's say PHP Apache with Selenium for test purposes? I don't recommend combining them. Ideally, you're keeping them separate and you're allowing them to talk over the networks. But it also depends on exactly what the tools are, exactly what your use case is, and exactly how you're going to deploy them. For example, Kubernetes has a concept of pods that allows you to have many different containers all together working as one without without combining them into a single image, right? So that's really great of Kubernetes. If you're using Docker or Swarm, those tools don't have the concept of a pod. So for example, if I was going to make a PHP on Nginx image, I might, for Docker Swarm, I might combine them into one image so that it spins them both up, and I'll use not systemd, but supervisor as a startup. Docker actually has something in their examples. If you look up Docker supervisor in the Docker docs, you will find an example of how to do that. I also have an example of how to do that doesn't work for PHP on my GitHub. If you go into my GitHub and just search my repos for PHP, you'll see an old example that is a little outdated, but the idea there is it's combining two different. It's taking one image and then installing the software of another image. It's not literally pushing them together. It's just adding stuff to an image until it becomes a complicated image. But in general, you don't want to do that with your images because your images will get too complicated and they get too hard to support. So with Kubernetes, we're allowed to have all these separate images, all in separate containers, all working as one. So if you're going to need to do something like that, but in CI, if you're talking specifically about CI, and I think that's your use case, like PHP with Selenium, right? So that's Selenium to me means you're testing. Do that in Docker Compose, right? Use Docker Compose or Kind if you want to test in Kubernetes, KIND. Compose for just straight up Docker, Kind for testing inside a Kubernetes cluster, and then you can still keep them separate and they're talking over the network to each other. So Selenium would be talking to the other app, and that way your app image is untouched. It doesn't have Selenium in it, which would change it from being a standard, it's going to have your tests still in it probably, or at least your non-minified, web stuff, and it's going to be a little different from your production image, but you'll be able to test that. Where did I buy this mug? Over the years, Docker has had lots of swag in their store and at their conferences. I don't know where I got this exactly, but at DockerCon and on the Docker Swag store, which I think they have at their website, if you go to the bottom, they have a swag store there somewhere. I've picked up a bunch of their swag. I've luckily, as a captain and as a community leader, those are two different roles that you can have at Docker, and I've been both of them. So over the years, I've lost count of the number of sweatshirts and T-shirts. I'm wearing a Docker T-shirt now from a Docker event that was up in Washington D.C. years ago. So I don't know if you can buy that. I don't know if Docker even has the swag store. Let's look at. I think it's like swagdocker.com. Nope. They have swag store. So if you scroll all the way to the Docker website, over here on the right, you can see swag store. And it looks like right now all they have is apparel and stickers. So, it looks like there's some nice shirts there. I don't have those, all those shirts, and then stickers. So you can get a bow tie. But yeah, they don't have the mugs. I mean, things come and go over the years. They've had probably over 50 T-shirt designs in the last 6 years. So sometimes it's sort of a race to see who can have all the T-shirts. A great talk on Kubernetes, says Martin, is advanced persistence threats. Ian Coldwater and Brad Geisman. Yeah, advanced persistence threats. That's cool. I mean, Ian's a security expert, so I'm sure they're going to have, I would watch anything they were in, any video that they were in. So again, that one's called advanced persistence threats. Yeah. By the way, if you asked questions at the beginning of the beginning, like I think someone asked, how can set up default backend service for Kubernetes Nginx ingress controller? So there's a lot of assumptions there. One is that you're using the built-in ingress, and that's a very specific question, and I don't actually know the answer off the top of my head. Basically, there's probably an annotation on how that Nginx. No, I'm not being in a. Yeah, I'm not sure how you do it. I know I've seen how you do it with custom ingress controllers, but I don't know how to do it on the the ingress, the Nginx ingress, and I don't know if you're talking about the official Kubernetes project one or the one from Nginx themselves. Most ingress controllers do have a fallback or failback default backend, and I don't know that. I don't have that memorized off the top of my head. Is it possible to change the default location of volumes, or are bind mounts the way to go? My root device is full and would like to store on my second hard drive. CSZ's pwn that's a great question. It's totally not on topic, but it's such a great question. I am going to tell you a tip. Tips of the captains. From Brandon Mitchell. Tips and tricks from the captains. All right. So go in here. I'm going to put this. This is a slide presentation from a Docker captain, sudo b Mitch. You might have seen him around Twitter. And if you're on Stack Overflow, he is the #2 answerer of all Docker questions on Stack Overflow. He is a very smart dude. And if you use the local volume driver, my point here is there is no way to change the default. So the short answer is the local volume driver, because what you're asking about is the built-in Docker volume driver. How do I change where it's going? There is no way to change the default. The settings that you make in the Docker engine for root are about the entire Docker installation, not just for the volumes. It's about everything, the images, the manifests, everything, the containers, the container layers that are on top of the images, all that stuff. It's going to change the root of all that and all the binaries, as well as the volumes, if you change that in the Docker daemon. So you don't want to do that. What you want to do is you want to customize in your, whether it's Docker or Compose or Swarm, however you're deploying your containers, you can change that. And he's got examples in this slide deck. So I'm going to throw you the examples. And most people don't realize it's even in the documentation. Most people don't realize it on how to change it. So let me just see if I can find a good example here. This is NFS. This, for example, this one is showing how to use the local driver, and this is in a Compose file, right? But you could do the same thing with the new -- mount. If you just did a Docker run -- mount, you could put all this stuff in there in a command line. But this is how you would connect to a different unrelated disk mount in Linux in order to use that for the volume using the local driver. Most people don't know this. This is actually that's why it's a tip and trick. It's a great one. I actually learned. I knew that this was possible, but I didn't have a really great go-to example until Brandon put this up. And if I'm lucky, he might even be on the chat today. Yeah, so this is also a named bind mount. So this allows me to use this is a bind mount where I also can give it a name. So the cool thing is bind mounts are normally outside of the Docker volumes command, but this allows you to keep it inside the volumes command, so you can use the volumes command on it, but it also changes the location. So you might, let's see, this one is good for dedicating to a different mount, and then this one, the named bind mount, is good for if you want to go ahead and put it on that same drive, that same mount point, but you just want a different location, right? Anyway, so that's a really cool one. I refer to his tips and tricks stuff all the time because he's got some great advanced examples there. But I hope you were still on. I hope you hung around. CSCZ's pwn. Yeah, awesome. Glad you hung out and stayed for that answer. All right. Thank you. I love this hat too. All right. Let's get to my little demo real quick because we are already at an hour and you're probably all waiting. So I'm going to put this in chat first. So you all can start taking a look. The documentation needs to be improved, but I definitely want you to test this and tell me what you think. And I don't even know what to call it. I could have come up with I don't know. I could have come up with a really cool name, and I didn't. Instead, I just went with what, search algorithms would maybe look up. But the problem here, we just scroll down a little. The problem this is trying to solve, all right, is you are a developer or a tester, or maybe, you don't even have to be that. You just have to be someone who's using Docker to run containers that are web apps. And it does more than just web apps, but because we can talk about how it might be able to do other things, but like TLS or TCP stuff. I'm pouring me some fresh coffee for the demo. So the thing that this is good for is when you want to test with TLS locally, and or you would like to use DNS names for local use. So if you're developing and you want to do, www.mydomain.com, api.mydomain.com, or maybe, www.myotherdomain.com, and all have that on your local port 80 and port 443. You don't have to do TLS, but this thing fully supports both or either. And you also want the certificate to be trusted, but you also want it to be free. You don't care if it's a production certificate because it's just for dev and test locally. And so I came up with this, and there's 3 main parts to it. So I don't have the entire description of how this is breaking down. I basically give you enough to get started, plus comments in the code so that you can get started. What I really need is like a sort of quick little walkthroughs of each step. So the first, to implement this, is a little bit of work, but once you've got it implemented, you're basically going to copy 2 files to every one of your projects, and you have instant local proxy TLS setup that will allow you to have many different containers with many different DNS names, all running on your local host, all with a trusted certificate. All right, and all in the same port, and I love that. Like I use that for Ghost blogs, WordPress blogs. You got to set up some websites. I want to run some Node apps. I can do all that at the same time with this proxy. All right. It might even be possible to change this as well, to have this be its own Docker Compose file that comes up. And then if you spin up a bunch of other unrelated Docker Compose files for your apps, this would still work with those, right? It can actually see that, because what we're using here is we're using a proxy from Traffic. And a lot of you have, if you see my courses, if you've been around a while, you hear me talk about Traffic. I talk about it at DockerCon. Traffic is not the only game in town. There's Envoy. There's, obviously there's Nginx and HA Proxy. There's Caddy. Caddy is another popular one for local dev setup. Caddy is really easy. But Traffic sort of stole my heart a couple years ago, and they had, they were one of the first, if not the first, to have built-in automated Let's Encrypt. Now, we're not using Let's Encrypt here because Let's Encrypt requires that the servers on the internet can talk to your machine, and that's not normal. Normally, your machine is not on the internet in a direct way, and there's not a port coming in your machine. You can do that, but I don't see the need to do that. Like, I don't need real Let's Encrypt certificates, especially since this solution solves it for me for permanently. I don't actually have to do that. All right. So the 3 major steps to implementation is you just have to decide on what URL domain you're going to use. And that domain needs to be a wildcard domain that points to the local host IP address. And it can be one that you buy. It can be one that you use that's already available. It doesn't really matter. I've given you 4 examples here, including one that I use myself called Bret LOL. So that essentially all it is a domain name with a domain provider that has technically 2 A records, but the main A record is a wildcard host A record that points to 127.0.0.1. which is your local host IP address. And so that domain name means, with the wildcard, means that anything .bret.lol on any machine in the world is going to look at the local host machine. Okay? Now, if you're using the Chrome browser actually has this built in. You can technically use something.localhost in Chrome. And so you could do that. But that only works in Chrome, doesn't work in Safari. I'm not sure if it works in Firefox. It's kind of spotty, right? And it's not going to work from curl or HTTP ping or any of the other tools on your machine. So I'd much rather use an internet provided one. The other examples I have, like the localhost one as I'm talking about here, that one's I think Chrome only. Edge might support it now. Who knows if Firefox has added it in? It might eventually become just a universal standard. vcap.me is hosted by VMware, and then the XP. I think I talked last week about XIP rather xip.io. That's another one that's popular out there. That's run by one of the creators of Basecamp. So there's no harm in you using these. There's no risk to them. It's not a backdoor. That's not how this stuff works. DNS is in this way. It's harmless. Even if I went and changed my DNS name on the back end to point to some rogue internet site on the internet, it would be the same as if you just typed in a website on the internet. It's not somehow going to give that website permissions, to your machine in any way. At least I can't fathom a way that's going to happen. So I plan on keeping the Bret LOL around. I'm not saying you have to use that one, but you might want to buy your own. What I just did was I went and bought a really cheap domain name. It was like $13 a year or something, and I just added a wildcard certificate. In fact, let me see if I can actually show you, just so you understand exactly what you have to do to set that up. It's really easy. I think every provider would allow this. Every DNS provider, rather. So I use Hover for my DNS. I used to use Namecheap and a whole bunch of other ones, but I consolidated years ago down to Hover. So if I go to Bret LOL, yeah, there we go. And then I go to DNS. I only have 2 records. All right. And those 2 records simply point to 127.0.0.1, and the whole point of this is that I need a DNS domain name to point to my local machine, especially the wildcard one, so that I can use any name I want on that domain name, and it's always going to point to my machine and talk to my whatever port I want locally. That's how that's how we work on the internet, right? The internet with ELBs, ALBs, load balancers, all that stuff. It's using name-based routing. And so we need this first. That's step 1. All right. So that you do that once. Like that's a one-time deal. The second one is one-time deal. You create a local self-signed wildcard certificate, and then you add it to your browsers. That's a one-time deal. So I have a script in here for you called cert.sh, and that is a one-liner, essentially a one-line OpenSSL. Now, if you don't have OpenSSL, I don't yet have documentation on how to get that if you're on Windows. But basically, just Google how to get OpenSSL, download it on your machine. You can even just spin up a temporary Linux VM if you want, if you don't want to install it on Windows. All you need to do is get the files that it generates. It generates, I think it's three files at this point. And you basically give it you type in this shell script and then give it one option, one environment variable at the end. And that's the name of the domain that you want to make a cert for. And then you create it, and it creates a 10-year long self-signed certificate. And then for each browser on your machine, you need to go in and accept it as a trusted certificate. You're never going to share this certificate. It's going to be on your machine only. There's no reason to share it because the rest of the people on your team make their own certificate, even if it's the same name. So it's just sitting on your machine. It's not even secret because if it gets out, it's never used in production. It doesn't matter, but there's no reason to put it in your source code, is my point. You just store it on your local machine. I store mine in a search directory. So I have if I go in here, I have, let me just zoom in on that. I have for each domain I might want to use someday as a TLS local host domain so I can develop on it locally. So none of these are production domains. They're all dedicated strictly to just being my local wildcard. So I have the Bret LOL. I might have some stuff in here for clients. I might have the VCap from VMware because that's the one I used to use. I might use the localhost one sometimes with Chrome because that's supported. And so you just store these on your machine. I have them in a .search directory, and they're always there. You never, and I make the certificates last for 10 years. So, in 10 years, run the script again. You can just change my script, and there's just a date field in there. You could just change that field to make it 100 years if you wanted. It's right here, right? Days on line 29 there, days. I just changed it to 10 years. So you can do whatever you want there. All right. So that is step 2. Again, one-time deal. One-time deal. Now that you've done those 2 things, everything else is easy and you just do it per project. And all it is, up at the top, is a traffic configuration for the proxy and then a Docker Compose file, because I'm assuming you're using Docker Compose, right? I mean, you should be using Docker Compose. So the traffic file, we won't get into necessarily because I got documentation for each one of these things, but I'm just going to spin it up and show you that it basically, it's doing a couple of things here. It's automatically going to bind mount all my certificates that I have locally. It's going to tell traffic about them. I think in this one I have it configured to only use the Bret LOL. So it's only using that one certificate. I could give it many certificates if I wanted, but I'm only using this one right now. I am telling it that anything that goes to port 80 automatically redirect to TLS because that's how most of our websites work. So I want that to be the way it works in my testing and my local development. And then I'm telling it, don't automatically expose all containers. Only put containers behind the proxy that I tell them in the compose file to do so. I enable the dashboard for local use. I tell it to only log warnings because I don't want it to dump a ton of logs. And then it's going to check for a new version, and it'll just tell me in the logs if there's a new version of traffic, right? Pretty simple. And then in my Docker Compose is where the magic happens. So I have an example here of 2 separate services. So it's just 2 regular images, and I'm adding 4 labels. So the real thing here is the 4 labels. This stuff isn't really necessary, although we can talk about that. That depends on isn't required for this to work. But the 4 labels, because traffic knows how to talk to APIs, it knows how to talk to Kubernetes API, it knows how to talk to Docker API, to Swarm API, and so it's talking to Docker, and it's seeing new containers spin up on the fly and then reconfiguring itself based on what Docker's doing. So if I add these labels to a Docker container that spins up, it will follow those directions. And I'm telling it, 1, use Docker. 2, this is the host name that I want you to respond to for this container. 3, I want you to only put this on the TLS endpoint. And 4, make that TLS endpoint, make sure that it's using TLS, not just regular HTTP. All right. Now I'm doing the same thing for a different service. The only difference between the 2 is the host name. Well, technically, that little router name there, you have to change the router name because a router is specific to routing traffic to a container. So each route would be a different name. So I just tend to name these the same name as my compose services. That keeps them consistent and a standard. So you just do that, and then you're spinning up traffic, right? Traffic is going to sit in front of all these, and it's going to be the thing listening on port 80 and 443, and then all the traffic on my local machine will go through it and then go to my backend containers. This is very much like how your production setup, whether you're using Docker or Swarm or Kubernetes or Nomad or ECS or whatever you're using, you're probably going to have some sort of load balancer in the front of that, whether it's an ALB or an ELB. And so this is a very similar setup to that production environment. All right, let's spin it up and just see how it works. So if I just do a Docker Compose up on this repo, it's not going to build any images, but it's first going to download traffic and spin that up. And that's because I use a depends on that is going to wait for traffic's health check to pass before it spins up my applications. Then it's going to spin up HTTP and Nginx at the same time, and they're going to boot normally like you would expect them to boot, and I'm done. So now, if we remember looking at that little file, let's go look at our DNS names, right? The DNS names I have for these 2 services are HTTPD and Nginx, and I have to use my full domain name. This is using that localhost wildcard DNS trick, right? Now, traffic also comes with a dashboard. So I can first go to localhost port 8080. That's the dashboard port that I configured. And this is the traffic dashboard. I showed this off last week. And then you can see in here that I have these 2 new rules. These are routes showing for my secure TLS traffic endpoint. They're on the endpoint, and this is basically telling me that it's going to take this traffic for this host name using TLS, using the web secure endpoint, which is 443, using this particular service in Docker right here. This is actually the name of the container. And it's telling me that little Docker symbol on the far right, it's telling me it's getting that from the Docker API. It knows about this because the Docker API is telling it about the labels. All right, so I know that that traffic is working. And then I just have to go over and say nginx.bret.lol. Okay, now I'm in Firefox for the very first time. I've never used this in Firefox. I've done it in Safari and in Chrome and maybe even in Edge. But this is what would happen your very first time. And this is because I'm not trusting the certificate. And I'm sure all of you have probably had to add a certificate manually. So I can do advanced. And if I go view certificate, I'm there. And I actually don't know how to do this in Firefox. I was kind of hoping Firefox would be awesome and make it easy. It doesn't look easy to me. Download. So I maybe have to download and import. Yeah. See, I understand that they're making this hard because it's a risky thing to do. But for temporarily, notice how it's just saying the error code is a self-signed certificate. So temporarily, I could just say accept the risk and continue. I get the little warning. But eventually, what you want to do is you want to add this into Firefox and your other browsers. If you're using on a Mac, for example, Chrome and Safari both use the host's key store, the keychain in Mac. So if you add it to Mac keychain, I did that last week. If you watched last week's episode, I did that already. Yeah, I don't see a way here. And it's not really letting me. Anyway, the point is that you would want to add that permanently so you never get the warning, and that's per browser. Now, if I go over to HTTPD, which is the other container, Bret.lol. This is the other composed service running the different container for Apache. Now remember, notice that I'm typing in HTTP. I'm not even going to SSL. And because of traffic, it's going to redirect from port 80 right over to 443. And it's going to give me the same warning because I haven't accepted it permanently. And I will accept. And now I'm on Apache. So these are 2 different domain names, both pointing to my local port 443 and using traffic to route to those 2 containers. And there you are. Now, all you have to do is take that boilerplate traffic file, you don't need to really change the traffic file unless you want your own DNS names for the wildcard certificates. And you don't, in the compose file, you just copy in your compose file, you just use it as a template, right? Just add your stuff in there from, where were we? Yeah. You're just going to add your stuff in here, and basically you're going to copy these labels into your own apps. So every one of the things you want to be published on the HTTP ports locally on your machine, you would just add those to it. And you would just change the router name and the host name. And that's the only 2 things you're going to change. All right? All right, so let me check on questions and see what questions we have about this. Yeah, so Ionis? I'm not sure. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Sorry. I have traffic in a Docker Compose by itself, and every other app on its own Compose, and they communicate through traffic network. So, yeah, that works too, and this solution could work with that because they don't have to. It's not about being in the same Compose file. I will say though, you'll have to make a couple of slight changes. I'm imagining you're already doing this. Is you're going to need to hard code the Docker networks to make sure that they're all in the same Docker network, because when you spin up a Compose file, by default, Docker Compose will spin up a new Docker network, and that traffic needs to be on the networks with the containers. So you'll just need to make a little change, and that could probably be like an extension or a variant of this example, is to say, I'm going to put traffic in its own, and it's always running, and any containers that show up in my Docker network will just automatically work, right? That's another way you could do this. Yeah, Firefox settings don't work like Chrome or Safari. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what I'll have to do later. But I did want to show the example. I specifically chose Firefox today because I knew I didn't have it in there, and I wanted to show that temporarily you're going to get the warnings until you go in and change it, and it's different for every browser and different for every OS. So, um, assuming you'd like to use a real SSL certificate, how to create a CSR file from the Docker container? Well, you would. I mean, almost every. That's if you need to create a CSR, Docker run it Ubuntu bash, right? Actually, I don't even need to type bash because it's already going to do that. But no, OpenSSL isn't in there. So OpenSSL was replaced. But you just install it in whatever, there might be some, like CentOS might have it, right? Anyway, you find an image with OpenSSL in it, or the replacement of OpenSSL that we all still keep calling OpenSSL, and then you just run the command from there, and then you have a bind mount, right? So you have a bind mounted directory, and then you just create that CSR, and it's then bind mounted on your host. So it's the same way you're asking me for that is the same way you would run any Linux tool in a container with files from your host operating system. It would be the same thing. Yeah. So there's, in fact, Docker, let's see. Yeah. So there's probably a bunch of people. Let's see if there's there's an image with only 14 stars, but someone else made an OpenSSL image. I wouldn't really rely on anyone else's. I would just do apt-get install OpenSSL or whatever. But yeah, that's how you would do it. Good question. Is it possible in traffic to use an Acme certificate in one domain and self-sign in second? Absolutely. Yeah, for each one of them, you could specify the certificate. And you do that, I believe you do that on the endpoint. So when you start learning about traffic, you learn about routes and endpoints and middlewares, right? And when you go and look at, when you go look at the dashboard on traffic, you see, routers, services, middlewares, right? Services are sort of the back-end things you're sending traffic to. Routers are the things. Middlewares are like fancy stuff that you can do all sorts of stuff with. In the middle, it's sort of like the mixing bowl. You don't have to have middlewares. And then you have down at the bottom, you can see providers. So providers are where it's basically saying, how do I get my configuration into traffic? And I'm providing it both a YAML file for some things, and then it's also getting dynamic updates through Docker providers. And then, where's my endpoints? So my entry points are up top here, right? So traffic comes into an entry point, it goes through middlewares and routers, and then ends up at services, which are your containers. And that's how traffic flows through. That's how packets flow through traffic. I almost said traffic goes through traffic, and it's confusing. So as packets flow through, they're coming into endpoints, going through middlewares and routers, and then on their way to services. I'm not sure if it's middlewares then routers or routers then middlewares. Not sure what's the order of that necessarily, but that's what you're doing there. And then, you can also, that's just for HTTP. You can also have raw TCP and raw UDP. I didn't even talk about that. Obviously, in those cases, they're not going to be using DNS names because that's specific to an HTTP header. At least I don't think. That would be very protocol specific, I guess is what I'm saying. So if you're going to use this to front end Redis or something else, it would be obviously on a different port, right? So in that case, I don't necessarily do that for traffic on my local machine. If I need MySQL or Redis, I don't put those in traffic. I just publish those ports in Compose, and then they're just on a high port. And I don't bother with traffic. I really just focus on traffic for all the web stuff this is specifically on my local machine I'm talking about. And so, yeah. And so you would put certificates, I believe, on the endpoints. And so you could dedicate certain endpoints, I believe. I might be wrong on this. I don't think that certificates go into routers. I might be wrong. I very well could be wrong on that. Let me, where's my repo? Yeah. So it does, one of the things it does is it does certificate host matching. So actually, now that I think about it, I'm wrong. So it will match based on the certificates you give it. So inside of, and I should have this in here as a test to show a good example. Sorry, not in there, but in the traffic file, I just add one certificate down here, but I could very well add a bunch. And my understanding is it does, it looks, what's the name? Someone's going to know this in chat. The name of the technology in TLS that allows it to look at the DNS name that's requested before it offers up the certificate. I can't think of what that is, blanking on the top of my head there, what that is. But I think that's how it works, so that you can serve up on the same port multiple certificates. Yeah, and then you can even default to, it's SNI. That's what it is, SNI. It's right here in my thing. So it uses SNI to do that. And then you can have a default fallback certificate even. There's a way to put defaults in there. I have this in as a troubleshooting step, which basically means that if, for example, on my local machine, if I had said something .bret.lol and I did not have a route for that, right? I didn't actually add this to my compose file, so I don't have no route. Then I'm going to get this 404 page not found. And that's traffic telling me that I don't have a route to that. And one of the things I wish is that they would have a better error message there. This is more of a production error message. I would rather have on development you can change this, I believe, in traffic. You can change the 404 page for this. I believe. I actually haven't done it. But I would probably want this example over time to have a better example there, maybe like the traffic logo that's like, you don't have a route. Go check your routes table in traffic in your configuration. Go look at your dashboard for all the HTTP routes and go look to see if you have a name for that. Because that's how I know that something's not working correctly for that name. All right. Blue-green deployments. Would be curious about how you can do blue-green deployments with traffic. Yeah, so check out their documentation and their blog. I'm sure they're going to have examples. I don't have one prepared for today. Let's see. Getting lots of questions. Hold on. He's talked about Acme. Can you use certbot from Let's Encrypt? I'm not sure exactly what that pertains to. Mihai, maybe. The Let's Encrypt functionality in traffic doesn't need certbot because it's built into traffic, which is kind of awesome. If you want to use certbot for some reason, you would probably be using a different solution. So, maybe you're on Kubernetes and you want to use cert store, cert manager, right? That project, like certbots, maybe something for that. Or if you're using Nginx and you're doing this a little bit manually on your own, you might look at certbot. But a lot of these solutions for orchestration are trying to get around that by basically saying you don't have to run certbot yourself. I don't recommend, and I don't think you need Let's Encrypt certificates on your local machine. Because once your browser trusts that 10-year-old certificate that I just created with a one-line command, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. Let's Encrypt is really, to me, for servers that you want other people's browsers to trust the certificates on your website. So that's what Let's Encrypt would be good for. And so that's why there are some great examples. By the way, I do post links to a good example of that in this repo. If you come up here at the top, it was inspired by this traffic compose walkthrough. So if you go to the site and you go to this example, it's another full walkthrough of how to do this in production with Let's Encrypt. This it's not really dev specific; it's more for production-y, but it's using the same setup: traffic with compose using TLS certificates. But that one is good for you if you want to use production Let's Encrypt. So. All right. What's next? What's next? If I have multiple microservices with different repository and each microservice has their own Docker Compose, how do we apply this demo in this scenario? Well, if first I would back up, and if we were working long term together, I would ask you, why do you do that? Like, even if I work with teams that even have 30 microservices in Docker Compose, and it completely handles the entire workflow. Usually when people make a bunch of different Compose files, it's because they don't fully understand how Compose workflows work. And that's not your fault, because Compose is actually quite advanced. Like, once you dig into it, it has a lot of stuff there. So for example, if I had 30 microservices, I could use the depends on feature that is specific to the 2.0 branch. And if I do that with health checks, and you see here, I'm using a version 2.4 of my Compose file. And in version 2, I can do these that kind of depends on, which means things actually wait till other things are healthy. It's super great. Always use version 2 for local development, always, until Docker fixes the problem we have between version 2 and version 3 Compose files. Version 3 is for Swarm, version 2 is for Compose files. For Docker Compose. So think about this, right? If you're using Docker Compose command line, do a 2.4 file. Unless you're using Swarm, there's really no reason to use version 3 files yet. Docker is going to, I think, work on this over time. They don't explain this in the documentation near well enough, and I keep trying to help, but it's hard. Changing documentation is hard, and we haven't yet got the documentation where I'm satisfied that makes sense for most people. So most people don't know this, but if you do that, then I could do something like Docker Compose up API. And then it only spins up the microservices and the databases that I specifically need for the API. And it waits for them to be healthy in the right order, even if it's a cascading order, before I can develop. The reason that's important is because that allows me to have a Compose file with 30, 40 microservices in it. And it's just a long Compose file, right? So that's step one. So that's kind of answering your question from a different way, is that I think you could probably do all this in one Compose file. Then you add templates. You can use YAML templating. So you take a lot of the stuff that's the same in every single one of your microservices, and like the environment variables are the same and all that, and you use Docker templating, which is in the docs. If you just look up Docker Compose templates, you can see that you can make little template sections and then just repeat them in every service. You can do things like environment variables files. Docker Compose, by the way, pulls in a .env automatically for all your environment variables. And you can do all this sort of cool stuff with it if you get into the advanced docs. A lot of it's in the docs, but you got to really study them. Anyway, that's one of the things I do for teams, is I try to be like their Docker Compose file experts. And anyway, second part of your answer is, if you want to do this with multiple Compose files, like I was saying earlier, all you need to make sure you're doing is in every one of those files, you hard code the network. So down here at the bottom, you put them all on the same named network, and then maybe you create it manually, and maybe you have every one of these using that. I'm trying to think. Yeah. I'm not sure exactly in Compose if you would need to if you need to create the network manually first. I'd have to test that, or whether it would create it automatically. But you would basically put down here a network and have them all added to the same named network. And as long as traffic is on the network with the same Docker network with those containers, it doesn't matter where the containers are running. It doesn't even matter if they're in Compose. It's just traffic is looking at the Docker API and saying, there's more containers. They're on my network. I'm going to route traffic to them if they have the right labels. So that's all that you need. So you could technically have 1,000 Compose files as long as they're on the same network. Hopefully that answers your question. Yeah. if you're using Docker Compose files, is there any downside to just run swarm commands even on single nodes instead of compose up? So Booby352, I would say I don't use Swarm for dev. I don't see a need for Swarm in development. It's not that it's bad. It's just that the Docker Compose up and the Docker Compose workflow is so developer focused that Swarm doesn't have that same workflow. And so I would lose a lot of the functionality and I would add the extra work if I was using Swarm locally. I am not someone who develops in an orchestrator. Orchestrators were not designed for development. They're designed for servers in production. So Docker Compose up is that workflow, Docker Compose down, Docker Compose run, Docker Compose exec, Docker Compose PS, Docker Compose build. All those commands are all designed on my daily workflow. Swarm doesn't have a build command. So then that means you're forced to use other tools like Docker build or Docker Compose build. And so my soapbox to developers is you never really need on a day-to-day basis to ever know a Swarm command, a Kubernetes command, or a Docker command to develop. Your entire development workflow is wrapped up in the Docker Compose CLI. So that's what I say. But no, there's no reason why you can't use Swarm. It's just harder. I don't know, with no real benefit. I don't know why you do it. But if you're on servers, yeah, that's what orchestration's for. Totally do that on a server. Great question. Great question. I do not use Let's Encrypt anymore. I transferred everything to Cloudflare's free, and yeah, use their certificates. It's a free service and proxies everything. So yes, I do the same thing. I think a lot of times what's easy is what works, and it is certainly easy to use Cloudflare. I also use what do I use? I use Cloudflare. I actually use Cloudflare for BretFisher.com, my main website. Right over there, my main website. That's actually using Cloudflare. I don't use Let's Encrypt. Well, technically, I think they're using Let's Encrypt, but I also use Netlify, which does. I love Netlify. Netlify is like a super powered GitHub Pages, and so I've used that. I use that for my workshops. I use that for my course slides. I have dozens of websites that run there, and it basically just pulls from a particular. It watches a GitHub branch in a specific repo. When it sees an update, it pulls it. It runs a bunch of, it processes it, and maybe it creates my minification and all that stuff if I need it, and then it launches a website on TLS using an automatic Let's Encrypt, and it's free. Just to do that for one person is free. You pay for like team features and stuff like that. But yeah, I have dozens of websites and I don't pay them a dime yet. Someday I might, and I would be happy to pay them. But so far I haven't had to need it. Anyway, Netlify is pretty great. Traffic. Yeah, search going wire and firewalls too. Yeah. You use Traffic Enterprise. We just figured out how to pass the source IP all the way through the container, so it's showing up in the logs. Very cool. Very cool. I saw your question also, Biker, earlier. I'll get to that in a second. I just want to get through some of these traffic questions. Right. So the reason that I have the depends, that's a great question. So Ionis, I know I'm messing up that name. Sorry. The reason that I have the depends on is because I don't want to have to say, Docker. I'm assuming you have a distributed app and you have many different containers and you don't want to spin them all up at all the same time, right? Most of us don't. We're working on one container with our bind mounted code at once, and we maybe need a few more. We don't need the whole thing. So I always add depends on in my examples because one, people don't realize how it works when you're using the health check feature, and so I always add it as an opportunity for education. And two, I just want to do Docker Compose up Nginx or Docker Compose up API. I don't want to have to say Docker Compose up proxy dash, Docker compose up dash D traffic or Docker compose up dash D proxy, and then do Docker compose up API or Docker compose up Nginx. I don't want to have to do both. So when I use the depends on, I chain everything in there so that because I'm not thinking about my proxy or my database. I'm thinking about my app. When I want to develop on the app, I just want to launch the app, and I may not even realize what other things it needs in that moment to start up. And so the depends on creates an easy developer workflow so that we can just get back to focusing on the development part and not on all of the infrastructure part, right? Because I look at traffic as infrastructure, MySQL is infrastructure. Like those are things that I just have to make my app work. Anyway, that's why I do it. You're absolutely correct that traffic doesn't have to be started first. It can be started at any time. But if I don't have that depends on, then I may forget, and then it doesn't work, and then I have to launch it. I have to spin it up manually with another Docker Compose up. So yeah, it's a great point, great question. However you want to do it is fine. The default in the container just gets the IP of the thing immediately. Yeah, and that's true of all container solutions. Like I don't care if you're on Docker, Compose, Kubernetes, like Swarm. Basically, we got a bunch of proxies in the way. So Biker's talking about that. At some point, if you're using web apps, you're in your container solutions, you're going to have to figure out a way to use proxy header to pass the client IP addresses back to your logging solutions in a more advanced way. We all have to deal with it. It's a pain, especially if you're trying to track per container, statistics and stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah. So you could create the network first, like I was saying. Thank you. Yeah, Biker. I mean, if you like your workflow to be with Swarm, that's great. But you're gonna have to know Docker commands. And my goal for developers, and I'm not saying you're wrong, but when I work with teams and I work with developers, my soapbox is really about, look, as a developer, I'm the DevOps guy, right? So you the dev team, I really don't want you to have to learn every Docker command. I'd really rather, if you're going to focus on one tool that you need to learn in the container community, because like let's think of all this stuff, right? Kubernetes, kube control, Docker Compose, Docker machine, Docker Swarm commands are technically different than the rest of the Docker commands. We've got Podman and the whole Red Hat variant of tooling. There's just an overwhelming amount of stuff. So one of the things I'm very conscientious of is I would love a developer if they knew one tool that we could all agree on so that their local development was consistent with everyone else's local development in a way that makes sense for everyone, because we're not all using Docker Swarm, we're not all using Kubernetes, and we all don't have the resources to run a local orchestrator. Because obviously now we're getting into the world where Kubernetes has an increasing number of local development tools and solutions that are all over the board that allow you to run either your local development environment against a local Kubernetes or against a remote Kubernetes. I mean, it's getting crazy, right? So the reality is that only those that are on the tip of the spear know all of this stuff, like the very few. But for the average developer, if they just learned Docker Compose and learned more than just Docker Compose up, but actually went through, in the command line and said, okay, Docker Compose. I just typed that command and let me look at all these, right? If you didn't realize it, every Docker command you're going to need for local development use is right here. You never need to even know Docker. You never need to do a Docker run or a Docker build because they're all right here. And they'll all use your compose file, configuration for building. And, you can do the full down thing. We all know about the down and the up. But you can list the images used. You can do a PS. Most people don't realize that you don't need Docker PS. You do Docker Compose PS because that will only show you the containers to that project. It won't show you anything else unrelated to that project. You can pull the images just for this project. You can push the images just for this project. And when I say project, that's the compose file. Compose files are a project scope. So all these commands are to the project scope. And it's fantastic if you start learning all these things. And Swarm doesn't have that. Docker doesn't have that. The only way you can do that in Kubernetes is to have namespaces, which are much more advanced commands. So when I work with teams, because someday if the team's using Swarm locally and then they later need to change to Kubernetes, now they got to learn a whole new thing, right? So Compose to me is the one tool that all developers could agree on, regardless of what their production looks like, whether they're running ECS, Kubernetes, Swarm, Nomad, Beanstalk, Lambda, they're all going to be containers running locally using Docker Compose. Now, I am not the internet, so I can't make us all use the same thing. I get that. We all have our preferences, but I do tend to win a lot of people over when I really start showing them all the things you can do with this one tool. For another example, is Swarm doesn't. I don't think Swarm works with .env files. So a lot of my projects, we will store a lot of secrets in the .env file, which is automatically picked up by Docker Compose, and that .env file is ignored by Git so that it's never stored inside of the repo. So we might have an example that has dummy secrets in a example.env or .env.example, and then you would just simply copy that into a .env file. If you're someone who's like a Ruby or a PHP person, you've used .env a long time, Compose uses it as well. And so any environment variable you put in with a $sign into a Compose file can be picked up by those secrets in that .env, but they're never run the risk of actually being stored in Git. And I don't believe that works with Swarm, for example, and certainly wouldn't work without an extra bunch of stuff in Docker run commands. So I could go on, but we'll have someday I'm going to make a Compose course. I'm going to make an entire course just on Docker Compose, because I think that once you really adopt all the advanced stuff of it, it is the developer workflow tool of choice until we get a better one. And maybe there's a better one out there and I don't know about it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. But Biker, you're totally not wrong. I'm not beating on you. I just think that if you change from Swarm, now your dev team all has to change their whole tooling. And that's a challenge, right? I hate for my developer tooling to be focused on the operations tool that is in production. I still don't see a lot of benefit by developers focusing on having to run the server production clustering tool on their local machine. But that's just me. If you're Kelsey Hightower, you don't even run containers at all locally for development. He says he does not develop in containers. He develops on the native host, and then containers are for CI and production. So, we all have our opinions. But it's I could go on forever, and I'm going to stop because I could talk about that forever. Trust IPs and... Oh, yeah, you're giving some more advice, Biker, on the traffic stuff. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't work in Swarm. And so, yeah, you can get it in there, right? For sure. Yeah, you could use a bash one-liner to get it in there, but again, then what ends up happening then is that developers start creating shell scripts to wrap these commands for Swarm, and why? Like it's one of these things where if we all had beers right now, like if this was beer and we were all sitting around debating dev setups, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You could go on for 10 minutes and tell me about all of the ways that your dev setup is cool. And I would probably learn a lot from all the different things that you've automated. But when I'm working with teams and I find out that they're automating a bunch of things with shell scripts, and I'm like, well, why wouldn't it just be a Docker Compose command? It's a one-liner. And you don't have to maintain a script. Because one of the things that companies pay me to do is they have like a dozen shell scripts. And I'm like, okay, we're going to replace all this with a Docker Compose command. And so I completely remove that automation with simple Docker Compose stuff. Now, it does require that they have to learn Docker Compose, right? I understand that that's a thing they have to learn, but once they've learned it, the team settled on a single tool, and so far I have a pretty good ratio. I'm close to 100% on getting teams onboarded with Docker Compose and them sticking with it as the tool of choice. Yeah, see, like Biker's saying, that's what I'm using. I'm processing by my scripts to inject my env variables. Right. So you have scripts, and with Docker Compose, you don't need scripts. So, you might need some aliases just to make the command shorter. But I worked with teams that had. I worked with a team a couple years ago that had 35 developers, 25 microservices. Well, they were creating more microservices for their monolith. They had 30 services in Compose, and I got them to one Compose file for everyone, plus an override file, right? So the override file automatically would override their local settings, plus a .env for their local secrets, but they all were using one Docker Compose file. And they had Windows developers, Linux developers, and Mac developers all on the same team, and they were able to agree upon one way to do it that everyone, not that they had to, because they could have just made a bunch of complicated stuff, but I basically got their whole DevOps repo of all their infrastructure stuff with automation scripts and, one-liners and having to export a bunch of things to the local machine and to your bash environment variables before you run these commands. Like the whole goal was install Docker Desktop, install your editor of choice, git clone your repos, Docker Compose up. Like that's the only thing, other than maybe getting a couple of secret keys that you might need for your username, like AWS secrets or API secrets or something that you would store in a .env file. That's my utopia setup for everyone. So we've all got a different setup, but I keep implementing that over and over with teams, and I'm learning as I go. And maybe someday I need to make a whole course just on that because I've done it now at least a dozen times with different companies over the years. Of all different, Java people, PHP people, Node.js, Ruby. It's a great conversation. All right, so I want to wrap it up. These are all great things. I think I had one last question from Biker earlier, and he talked about syslog. Let's see if I have an answer to that one. You want to grab syslog output and send it to Splunk. It seems that we have to start the rsyslog service in addition to the web service in the same container. Is that a problem? Well, okay, that's interesting. So Docker has a Splunk driver. So I'm assuming that you've probably done a bunch of stuff, Biker, so that you know that this is the only way you're going to be able to do it. So one, there's a Docker has a syslog driver. Docker has a Splunk driver. But if you need to, for some reason, run multiple binaries in a container, the way that I prefer to do it is, and I will just show you. Let's see, I'm just going to say multiple. Yeah, so I know this is a page. Run multiple services in a container. So Docker gives this example where you use, this is a Docker file. Basically, you're going to use, instead of systemd, you're going to use supervisor. I think it's a little more lightweight for this use. And then you're going to create a supervisor configuration file for each one of the binaries you want to spin up. So I will put this in chat. So that's Docker's example. My example of this is on my PHP. Do I have a PHP? Yeah, PHP Docker good defaults. So if you look at this repo for PHP defaults, ignore the fact that it's PHP and just look at, for example, I have a supervisor D config down here at the bottom. All right. So my Docker files are spinning up supervisor, and then supervisor's job is to spin up my app and any other dependencies I have. So in this case, supervisor D, and you can use this config. I'm not going to say that it's production hardened, but I have used this in production with a team, and it was vetted a little bit. So I feel comfortable saying that this setup is qualifies for production evaluation. And so what I'm doing here is I'm spinning up supervisor, and I'm actually spinning up supervisor with an endpoint to monitor supervisor, because now your health checks for this container need to include supervisor because it's one of the binaries running in the container. So technically you're running supervisor, and then if you're running two different apps, the syslog and then the app itself, so now you're running three binaries. Supervisor is the root, it's the PID 0. Or is it PID 1? I always forget. I think it's PID 1. And then you can see here I'm doing like, this is PHP setting up, and then this is me spinning up Nginx. And you can see where I'm telling it where to put its logs and telling it to send the logs to std out so that Docker can pick up those logs. And then I would use a Docker logging driver. If it's your case, you have to use syslog and use syslog to send them. I'm sure you've got a good reason, and you probably already looked at all this stuff. Yeah, so I would do that. And then don't forget in your monitoring solution to monitor supervisor. Now, supervisor, obviously, if something else crashes, like if your app crashes or the syslog crashes, supervisor will, in theory, respin those up. But I tell it to basically give me a port. I think it's a socket, so that I can test it through the socket. I think is how I did it. It's been years. But you want to monitor that, and that way you have to have it available for being monitored. Now, if I go to the Docker file, if you look at the bottom of the Docker file, it's spinning up supervisor. That's all it's doing. So all the other apps that are in there will be using the supervisor config file. So line 92 will tell you, it'll tell supervisor, hey, spin up. Don't run it in the background, run it in the foreground so that it stays running as my Docker command, and then use this config file that I'm giving you in the actual image. All right, and with that, I think we've got all the questions. Is there a good example of a website that compares versions 2 and 3? So the documentation, I wouldn't say, maybe the docs. Maybe the docs. This is a great question. If you just go to the docs and then go to compose. So go to release notes. Actually, that's compose. We want compose. We want compose file. Yeah. So if see on the left side here how I have version 3, version 2. So you can look at the different versions, and then often it'll also tell you when you're looking at a particular feature, this only supported in version 2 or version 3.5 or whatever. And then when you click on about versions down here, it talks a little bit about the compatibility of which versions of the file works in which Docker engines. And then, this is the whole, the compatibility matrix. Where am I looking? There was a version somewhere in here, I think it is. So anyway, look around these files, dig into each of them, because there's a lot of stuff. It's not well organized. And it does talk a little bit about version 2 and the differences. The big problem is all of this versioning problems is that they created version 3 because of Swarm. They needed a multi-server concept, and the compose file previously in version 2 had no idea of what a multi-server. It didn't have a deploy command or anything like that, a deploy object. So they added that in 3. The problem was they didn't bring every feature from 2 forward. They didn't bring extends. They didn't bring the depends on. They didn't bring some of the, for example, if you go into version 2 and you scroll all the way down to some of these, like the device read write options that are in here for version 2, or if you scroll down to enable IPv6, A lot of these settings that are very specific to maybe the kernel or the machine itself weren't added to 3, mostly because Swarm didn't support it. And so I think Docker is working on this. Now that I wonder, this might actually be answered. Docker compose spec GitHub. So there's now that Docker has created a spec, there was a goal, and I don't know if they actually finished it. There was a goal to make it might actually be in the compose and Kubernetes, but there was a goal for them to do that. Basically, understand the implementations and the different differences of the specification. Compatibility matrix. Maybe this is it. So this is. Oh yeah, no. So if it had one more row in here that was version 2 with Docker Compose CLI, because really what we're asking is the Docker Compose CLI versus Swarm stacks. Because if you're not using stacks, there's no reason to use version 3 at all. I'm not aware that there's anything in version 3 that is useful for Docker Compose command line that you don't get unless you use version 3. But this particular table, because you can use this is a functionality that Docker created that you can add into a Kubernetes cluster to use Docker Compose files in Kubernetes. And they're showing here all the different features in the Docker Compose file and whether those work in Swarm or Compose in Kubernetes. And what it would be cool is if there was a third one for Docker Compose CLI. That would be very helpful. But I don't think we have that yet. It wouldn't be much to change it though, or fork it, because most people aren't using Docker Compose for Kubernetes. So this would be much more useful, I think, in terms of Swarm. Technically version 2, version 3, but Swarm versus Docker Compose CLI. Because you can see there's a lot here, right? I mean, we're talking about 50 or more things. Yeah, there's a lot there. A lot of stuff. So maybe someday somebody will do that. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for the questions. I'm sorry if... yeah, Swarm in production? Totally. I use Swarm in production all the time. Right now, BretFisher.com is on production Swarm in a 3-node cluster in DigitalOcean. 700 companies, at least, at Mirantis, who used to be Docker Enterprise, all use Swarm in production. Like, I think they said something at some point, 80 to 90% of all Docker Enterprise people were using Swarm. Does it have limits that you will eventually maybe grow out of and maybe go towards Kubernetes? Yes. But I think for small setups and small shops, when you're a single person server admin, totally look at Swarm first. Kubernetes is a lot of work for one person. So I tend to recommend Swarm when you're a small one-person shop. If you're the only one who's going to know when Swarm goes down or Kubernetes goes down and you have to fix it, try to use Swarm first. Or look at Nomad, which I haven't kept track of lately, but it's like Swarm. Do we any other production-ready secret manager than Vault? I like sealed secrets. So this will be one of the last questions. Sealed secrets. So if you're looking at Kubernetes, look at Bitnami Labs sealed secrets. It's a way to avoid using Vault. You could also look at a cloud secret manager like AWS Secret Manager. But if you don't want to have a secrets manager, but you want to store secrets securely in Git, look at sealed secrets. Basically, it uses public key encryption and it encrypts the secret, puts it in Git, so you can put it in GitHub, and it ships with your stuff. And then inside of the Kubernetes cluster, it has the private certificate to decrypt, the private key to decrypt those secrets, and then apply them to into Kubernetes. I mean, technically, Kubernetes and Swarm are both secret stores. Vault can be a lot to manage for one person if you're a one-person shop or a two-person shop. So I typically don't recommend Vault unless you have really complicated needs. My Not that Vault is bad. It's just it's another thing you have to protect. You have to keep. It's a security risk, so you have to keep it up to date. You have to keep it hardened to keep it protected. So I'd rather not do that if I can avoid it. So that's a great question. Yeah, and if you're using Swarm, Brian, yeah. So if you're in Swarm and your app needs depends on, then your app needs, if you can, you need to change your app. Your app needs to use retries because Swarm and Kubernetes don't really have a distributed computing concept of wait for it, because in distributed computing, we don't do that. We don't do wait for it, because wait for it is all about waiting for one thing to start for another thing to start. But in a distributed computing architecture in the cloud, things are going up and down all the time. So all the parts of your app should be designed to handle outages, even if it's an outage for 5 seconds or an outage for 5 hours, right? So I strongly recommend that you, unless this is for local development on Kubernetes or Swarm or something, that you don't look for a wait for it option, that you really start to think about the 12 factors. If you ever looked up 12 factor, look at that as the way to design your application. So it's all about retries. It's all about if and the backup plan for if you don't have retry abilities in your app for connection retries, then what you do is you have your app crash, and then your orchestrator will recreate the container or restart the container for you. And that's a much more distributed computing way of doing it. If you read all the books and all of the stuff on the internet about design and architecture, wait for it is a very legacy way to do it, because it doesn't account for all the scenarios, right? Wait for it's not going to help you when you're running your app and in the middle of it, your API goes down and your website is already up, so it can't wait for it anymore, right? So you have to account for more than that. If you're running someone else's code and you can't control it, then I get it. That you can only do what you can do. But I would advise you check out 12 factor and distributed computing books on that topic. Swarm versus K8s. A lot of people, Anton, have tried to compare Swarm and Kubernetes, but it's really hard to do. I do it in my course a little bit. So if you've taken Docker Mastery, course links are down below. If you take Docker Mastery, I teach you Swarm, and then I teach you a little bit of Kubernetes, and I compare and contrast when it makes sense. But at this point, Kubernetes is such a huge ecosystem that it's really hard to compare. Swarm meets the needs of many teams and many projects, but then you might have one requirement, and there's many different requirements that could cause this, but one requirement that says, oh, we got to switch to Kubernetes. And it's really hard to say, because they're both, there's lots of solutions for each, and there's lots of things that you can do in each, but Kubernetes is more work to learn, more work to implement, more work to support. So if you can learn Swarm in a couple of days, which my course tries to help you do that, and then you can get it to work and it works for you, then stick with it. The idea of the container tooling in the container ecosystem is that these things are flexible enough that you can switch, right? If you need Swarm today and then in 3 months you need to move to Kubernetes, you shouldn't, other than learning Kubernetes, which you would have had to done anyway, you may not have to do a lot of rework, right? Compose files turning into manifests aren't that much work, unless you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of containers, obviously. Yeah. All right. All right. For those of you joining, I apologize, but I've been on for 2 hours and I'm going to take a break. So I'm here live every Thursday, usually at 1 p.m. Eastern US. So the time you're seeing it now, the way to get this and the way to know about it is either to jump on my Patreon, which I talked about earlier. So jump on my Patreon and follow me. I'm always telling everyone there, you don't have to pay for a membership to get my updates, but you can use the app to get notifications on anything I'm releasing. I'm going to be sending out more Patreon updates this week, including next week. We're going to have for the $5 High Fiber Club memberships. We're going to have a Zoom call next week, our Zoom Hangout every month for DevOps professionals. And then I'm also going to be sending out an update, hopefully in the next week or two, on my TLS setup over here. And once I get the documentation up to snuff, I'm going to send that out to everyone in Patreon as well and talk about it. So You can get that stuff there. If you're watching me on YouTube, like and subscribe, like all the other channels tell you. You can see up there, right up at the top, Bret.live is how you get to my YouTube. And if you click the little dinner bell, the little bell icon, then you'll get notifications when I go live every Thursday, and sometimes other days as well. Next week, I'm going to have a special guest, and we're going to be talking about how to learn Docker tooling in a month of lunches. So that's going to be exciting. I don't want to spoil it. You're just going to have to show up next week, and we'll talk about some stuff. Might even have a few giveaways. You never know. All right. Ciao, everyone. Thank you so much. I'll see you next week.